Good morning, everyone. My name is Prabjot Khan, and I am gender specialist from Gender Equality Thematic Group of the SDCC. We are pleased to have you with us on day 2 of the training program. Today, we will elaborate on the gender inequalities linked to the systemic and structural issues in the transport sector. And we will share with you gender design entry points that will lead to inclusive and sustainable transport policies and project outcomes. Later in the sessions today, we will also showcase ADB project examples that have brought or expected to bring transformative change in women's lives. Finally, we will provide an opportunity through an interactive session to put new knowledge into practice with interactive exercises in virtual setting. But before we move further, I request Pamela Chan, Senior Transport Specialist from Transport Sector Group, SDCC, to give us opening remarks. Thank you. Over to you, Pam.
Thanks very much, Prajot. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining this dialogue today. Traditionally, ADB's transport projects have focused on large-scale infrastructure, delivering the road systems, rail, ports, and airports that have played a significant role in enabling social and economic development across Asia and the Pacific. And these have created opportunities for growth, and they have generated jobs and facilitated trade. However, there is an increasing recognition and awareness that provision of physical infrastructure alone is no longer adequate to meet the fast-changing demands of transport users. So as we all know, the issues are becoming increasingly cross-cutting and complex. For example, transport systems cannot now reopen until health and safety measures are in place. Decarbonizing of travel could not happen soon enough without drastic energy transformations empowering mobility. And crucially, cutting across all these considerations, gender equality plays a prominent role in the design, the delivery, operations, and the functional purpose of transport systems. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Thank you. So in the past year, we commissioned a transport foresight study to look at a global level, like what are the emerging trends that will impact on transport services. Now, as one would expect, technological advancement, climate, environment factors were identified, but crucially, behavioral changes and shifts have come up as important factors. Now, for example, a new economy is emerging. Shifts in skilled and unskilled labor in construction employment, now increasingly automated, for example, particularly in this pandemic, as we see, increased use of Internet of Things and drones, etc. And shifts towards increase in informal jobs in urban logistics sector, for example, like online shopping and food deliveries. And there's also a change in working patterns as we are all, mostly practicing now, remote working, as well as learning patterns. So the important questions are then, for how long are these trends here to stay, and what is the impact on transport system requirements? What are the aspirations and preferred futures? Are our transport systems designed for transport user needs of tomorrow or 10, 20, 30 years later? Now, as today's topic is on gender and transport, we shall be discussing some future possibilities through the gender lens. As we all know, there are many faces of women. She could be a leader, a worker, a mother, a caregiver, a homemaker, a mother, and much more, or even all of those. Now, how can all of us here today, through the design of transport projects and services, empower women to make choices to pursue her preferred futures? Enabling those decisions, I feel, is absolutely key. So in the Foresight study, a set of draft visions has been developed to stimulate discussion and inspire new pathways and approaches for investment planning and transport policy. Now, these visions incorporate the ADB Strategy 2030 operational priorities and quality infrastructure principles. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So 8 draft visions were developed covering a wide range of future aspirations. But let me share a sneak peek of just one of the visions that is, I feel, particularly relevant to gender, which we are keen to promote. Now, this particular vision is to catalyze the development of spaces and services that are accessible, safe, inclusive, and affordable for all users. And underpinning this vision are design principles such as, for example, the first is on integrating formal and informal transport networks. And this is to improve physical networks, for example, smooth integration of informal and formal transport systems to allow women to move the agricultural produce from farm to market, and also to move from home to employment. Another principle underpinning this is ensuring personal safety on and around public transport for all. And this is to design to promote enhanced safety through, for example, lighting, removing blind spots, promoting active frontage on key pedestrian routes, and also ensuring physical accessibility. As mentioned, oftentimes women are in caregiving roles. How can we adjust the design of transport systems to make it more convenient for women and their dependents to move around? Now, in the interest of time, I'm unable to share the other visions, but I would urge you to have a look when our foresight study is published. But there is also a vision on strengthening institutional and technical capacity, as well as innovative partnerships, which are also highly relevant to gender mainstreaming efforts. So overall, a paradigm shift away from focusing largely on construction of physical infrastructure is needed to consider transport as an enabler of service. And this should result in a combination of not just physical, but also non-physical interventions, such as policies and reform. Now, in 2020, about 2/3 of ADB's transport investments were gender mainstream. While this is a great achievement, the remaining 1/3 presents an opportunity and room for further improvement. So I hope today's session will give all of you a fresh perspective on how to approach gender mainstreaming in design and implementing transport projects. We will talk about how user-centered approaches are important. We need to move beyond a cookie cutter approach in gender design elements. And we need to better understand user needs. Sex disaggregated data is needed for planning and to understand women's mobility patterns. And how can we tap an innovative technology to enhance mobility for women? And at a more fundamental level, I feel, how do we increase entrepreneurship opportunities for women through transport and remove gender stereotyping in transport institutions with workplace policies and practices to incentivize women's professional development and opportunities for leadership? So on behalf of the transport sector group, I'd like to thank the the gender team for putting together this rich and exciting lineup of discussions. So thank you very much, and handing you back over to Prashant. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, for these remarks. I think indeed these are very important points. We all look forward to the foresight study that you're going to publish soon. And to move forward, we have planned this day in 3 sessions. So we will now go over to the session 1, where we will discuss gender issues in the transport sector. And to discuss these issues, we now have with us Sonal Shah, who will give her presentation and take us through the different gender issues that exist in the transport sector. Sonal is Executive Director of Center for Sustainable and Equitable Cities, CSEC, and the founder of Urban Catalysts. She is a multi-sectoral professional with 15 years of experience in catalyzing urban change through technical expertise, consensus building, strategy development, team management, fundraising, teaching. She's very passionate about people-oriented cities with a focus on sustainable transport, gender, informality, and universal access. Sonal was also featured in the Remarkable Women in Transport by Transport Urban Mobility Initiative to me in 2020. And in India's National Institute for Transforming India, that is known as Niti Aayog, she has been a Women's Entrepreneurship Platform and UNDP cohort of 2020. Her presentation is titled as "What Do Women and Girls Want from Transport Systems to Improve Their Mobility?" Her presentation is going to be about 25 minutes. And we hope to, have some question and answer after the session. But please feel free to post your questions during the session in the chat box, and we will try to take questions from there. Over to you, Sonal. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabjot. I'm happy to be here this morning. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. And my screen is visible and in full screen mode.
Yes, Sonal.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Yes. So, yeah, thanks, Prabjot, and thank you, Pam, for very, very interesting and comprehensive overview of what the transport sector team at ADB is doing. I'd say that I'm also partly an insider, having consulted on multiple transport projects with the ADB. And so I hope to kind of bring those experiences here as I outline some of the issues around what women and girls want from their mobility systems. So I think, as was outlined yesterday, in terms of the importance of recognizing gender and socioeconomic context in how it informs the mobility choices for women and girls. And while there are multiple aspects to be considered, some of the key things that I will highlight is the disproportionate burden of both household and unpaid care work that women undertake, as well as the patriarchal gender norms that restrict women's movement both at the household and at the community levels. And therefore, it is important, and I know that we also do it in our projects, to conduct a gender analysis while we begin to think about mobility and mobility choices. I think, as was highlighted yesterday, we know that the lack of access to transport reduces women's participation in the workforce by about 16.5%. And we also know that the provision of transport infrastructure can increase the participation in the workforce. And case an example being in Bangladesh, where better rural roads increased women's labor supply by 51% compared to 49% for men. With this, I would also like to share our first poll question, if you will, Mark.
Now, Sonal.
Yeah, sure. We would really appreciate if the audience could answer this question. We will have multiple poll questions over here through the presentation.
Okay, we reached 60%. Do you want to see the results?
Yes, and I can see that here. Our question was, able-bodied men, generally in the working age groups of 15 to 19 to 59 years, are a minority user group. Okay, and we say that this is false. Let's move ahead and let's see our what lies ahead. Yeah. Okay, so currently in Asia, so yesterday we also heard both Jamie and this morning Pam highlight understanding who are the user groups and who are the end users. And one of the things that we will do today is to understand who this user group is from gender and intersectional lens. If we look at data from Asia, we find that men in the age group of 15 to 59 years typically the target group of most projects only constitute about 33% of our population. But if we begin to increase the diversity of these user groups, and particularly we're talking about women, girls, we're talking about able-bodied women and girls, women with disabilities. When we look at infants, toddlers, and adolescents, for whom women currently are predominantly caregivers, we recognize that if our transport infrastructure begins to expand the needs of a wider group of people, we can therefore increase the utilization of this infrastructure and services. And I think that currently there is a reason why a majority of our public spaces are dominated by able-bodied men within this age group. And I think that we will need to recognize that expanding this and catering to the differential needs of women, girls, and other groups will expand the utility of transport services. The second thing that we have seen being continuously highlighted is that transportation is perceived as an asset and not as a service, right? Where the focus initially has been on physical infrastructure, so be it a transport terminal, a public transport corridor, which then become insufficiently connected to the communities that they want to serve. And there is a need to recognize that we also have to we also have to improve access to these infrastructure projects, as well as ensure that gender is also included in the services, operations, in the information, in fare integration, as well as institutional integration in meaningful ways. We'll just proceed to the next poll question, please. And we will show you how this plays out in terms of recognizing the aspects and importance of also the non-physical aspects of transport systems by understanding the difference in the mobility between men and women. So this question aims to understand how women's mobility is different from that of men, and we would appreciate you polling on this question. Okay.
I'll stop sharing. So now,
yeah, so currently I think the answer is none of the above, and we will go into this, and we have about 53% of the respondents saying that, and we will go and delve deeper into how women's mobility is different from that of men. Let me just move ahead. Okay, so like I mentioned before, that women's travel is more likely to be characterized by trip chaining, predominantly to their current role in household and care work, which means that women are more likely to combine multiple purposes as part of one trip. Again, we will see that women are more likely to be accompanied by other travelers, so be accompanied by dependents, be it children or the elderly. And women are more likely to travel both consistently in the peak and in the off-peak hours compared to men. So with men, we see that we see a sharper difference in the travel between the peak and the off-peak hours, right? And this is data from the ITF for multiple cities in Asia and elsewhere as well. What we are seeing is in the current scenario that women's travel distances are shorter than that of men's. And however, I think we should not essentialize this difference, because it is important that while we measure these, to also understand why this may be so. And there can be multiple reasons for this. One is what we understand is called forced immobility, where women's travel is constrained due to multiple reasons, some of which might be due to unavailability of affordable and accessible childcare. It might also be due to safety considerations. So, or in other cases, that women may be forced to make trips due to poor sanitation or the lack of private sanitation. We also have data from multiple cities in Asia which show that women are a higher share of women are traveling in the off-peak hours as compared to men. And in the case of Delhi, where we conducted a survey with women informal workers, we found that the majority of their trips, and these were work trips, mind you, were in the off-peak hours, but due to unavailability of frequent public transport services, these were catered by paratransit. And we also see that in many instances, due to the shorter travel distances for women, they tend to rely more on paratransit services, even though they are more expensive. Just kind of sharing some other ideas of the differences between men and women in what we understand as the mobility of care. Traditional transport planning focuses on work trips as the predominant travel purpose, followed by education. However, we also need to recognize that women play currently the predominant household and care work. And in the case of a state in East India, Bihar, we found that 33% of their trips were for household and care work. These were household purchases and for care trips. How do you calculate that? Let me give you an example. A mother accompanying her child for an education trip then begins to also recognize that this, while being an education trip, is also a care work related trip. And we need to measure this in order to understand women's mobility of care. So here, for example, we noticed that about 70 to 80% of the trips for household and care work were being performed by women, where in the context of very low workforce participation, only 18% of work trips were being made by women. We are seeing that in multiple cities in Asia Pacific that women tend to, and particularly, and we're seeing like a dichotomy, is that they constitute a majority of pedestrians in many cases and of paratransit services, while there we see a very low use of motorized two-wheelers. Interestingly, for higher income women who are able to afford, or their households are able to afford personal motor vehicles, we see a higher share of car trips, where in fact, the overall trips by cars may be only 1%, right? So the the importance of doing gender disaggregated analysis of travel behavior to reveal what are the differences in travel, modes of travel, travel purposes, travel distances, and also travel times. For example, in Vietnam, it is observed that women tend to walk and use non-motorized transport more than men, resulting in longer travel times, even though their distances may be shorter, resulting in what we understand is transport contributing to time poverty for women as well. In a research conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2015, where they did a survey across 44 countries, one of the things that they found, and I think the data was really interesting, was there is a wide variation in the ownership of cars. So 83% in South Korea to about 2% in Vietnam and Bangladesh, right? So we have a very low percentage of car ownership in general. In China and India, this was about 17 and 6% respectively. But even within this, when we look at the gender differential in the ownership of cars, we see that only about 30% of cars in China are owned by women. We know that a majority of motor vehicles in the LMIs, the low and middle income countries in Asia, are two-wheelers. But what women's restricted access to personal motor vehicles also makes them more reliant on public transport. What we are seeing also is that apart from some countries, for example, like in China, where we are seeing a proliferation of public bicycle sharing systems, in other contexts where women's access to cycles could potentially increase their travel distances and reduce their time poverty, there are multiple issues related. First, the access to bicycles, or where bike stations are located, or the availability of safe parking facilities, knowing how to ride and maintain a bicycle, the fear in initial stages of cycling alone, road safety, which is a really big concern when we don't have dedicated cycle tracks for cycling, and providing safer cycling at junctions, as well as cultural norms, where in some countries, riding a two-wheeler, for example, may not be accepted culturally, right? So the reason for pointing these out was to understand the differential access and modes that are used by women and girls. Now, we also want to understand from you what constitutes gender-based violence.
I'll stop sharing, Sonal.
Sure, and I can see that 91% of the group has said that it is all of the above, and that is correct. Gender-based violence, especially with partners, they may only recognize violent or gruesome incidents of violence, but one of the things that we see and we recognize is that gender-based violence is also the daily acts of harassment that women, girls, and gender minorities face on a regular basis. And it is not only about the experience of sexual harassment, but also the perception of safety that can constrain women's mobility and access. And often it can be the primary decision-making factor for women's travel. I think there is data from multiple cities in Asia that talk about the prevalence of sexual harassment, both in streets, in public transport, in terminals. And we also need to recognize that there might be differentials by age. For example, in one of our case studies in a state like Kerala, which fares relatively high on some gender indicators, we found that women in the age group of 18 to 24 years were more vulnerable to sexual harassment than older women. So understanding the nuances by age, and I'll also come to income, becomes a very critical factor. We do know, what some of these reasons are. These can be either deserted or crowded public spaces and transport, dark spaces, the lack of visibility. And while some of these are the physical infrastructure aspects, there are also ineffective grievance redressal systems, which may mean that the transport authority may need to liaise with the police, with the Department of Women, in order to ensure that we have effective grievance redressal systems, and addressing awareness and mindsets in a meaningful way and on a regular basis. We've spoken about women and girls. We also need to acknowledge the experience of transgender groups who face different forms of violence in public spaces and transport, when we only think in binaries of men and women. I'm going to go through some of these other aspects. We've spoken about safety, we've spoken about differences in mobility. I want to kind of go through some of these slides to talk about the design and the specifications of vehicles, for example, where it depends not only in buses, but in paratransit services, thinking about cares, nursing spaces and caregiving spaces, for example, especially when we have very young children. And thinking about our transport infrastructure in how can it become more responsive to caregivers, so that they can move seamlessly and with comfort. Right? Bringing this other aspect of affordability, which when an over-focus on only physical infrastructure does not recognize the differential needs of different income groups of women. And this is a survey based in 11 cities in India, where we found that, in fact, some of the lowest income groups and had said that they would use public transport, but that increased when we looked at higher income groups of women. And what was it that they prioritized when we looked at the differences between women? One was that affordability emerged as a very key factor. And I think that when we think about gender analysis and we think about gender equity, affordability needs to play front and center in this discussion on the use of transport infrastructure. And affordability, especially in urban transport, needs to look at the door-to-door journey and not only the fare of the main mode of transport. We are seeing a proliferation of ICT-based technologies, but we also need to recognize the gender gap and therefore plan how there can be multiple technologies that can improve women's access to information. I'm just going to do a poll question and wrap up in about a minute or two.
This is the last poll for this presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, we reached 60. Let's end.
Yeah. And yes, women constitute about 18% of the transport workforce. And I'm going to, so very quickly, I'm going to make some key points that while women and women's groups may be consulted during the project design phase, I think that they also are predominantly perceived as beneficiaries and not as agents of change, so that their participation can be throughout the project cycle and after as well. We are seeing, I think has been mentioned before, that women decision makers are not represented sufficiently in housing, urban affairs and transport, but we can also use this opportunity of their dominance in the family, children, youth, elderly, disabled departments, women affairs and gender equality and social affairs, and bring them into the discussion on gender equality in the transport project. So they can be an additional stakeholder that can be included as well. I think we've already spoken about the very low share of women in the transport workforce, and there will be multiple aspects that will be required that will to increase the participation, ranging from internship and apprenticeship opportunities, recruitment, retention, mentorship, and promotion, so that these are part of a gender-friendly workplace policy overall. With this, thank you for this, and happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you, Sonal. These were very interesting points. Unfortunately, we have just run over a little time. So we have got very interesting questions on the chat, and I would request everyone to put in their questions on the chat. And I would request you that if you can respond in chat so that we can move on into the other session. We have a full agenda today. We will move on to the second session, but please continue to type your questions, and Sonal, please continue to respond there. And continue your discussion there. I'm sure this is a very interesting topic. And the second topic, the second session that we have now is on the gender entry points. And I would now request my colleagues to put up the next presentation. Meanwhile, for the second session of the day, joining me in moderating this session are Alice Rosero from the Central West Asia Department and Pam Chiang from the Transport Sector Group. So I welcome them both on the screen. And so Sonal actually shared about the different gender issues in the transport sector, and I will straight away now go into the different entry points. We will first have a small presentation, then we will move on to the case studies. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So from this slide is basically, you can see that the design and the implementation of gender responsive and gender inclusive urban transport projects require a gender analysis and a policy dialogue during the planning and the design phase, and emphasis on gender capacity development for the transport sector, for executing and implementing agencies and the private sector plan during the implementation. There are different elements of the issues to be considered for the gender analysis. So first we start with the policy. For policy, we can see that, how we can integrate a gender perspective into transport sector through the policy and the institutional and increase consideration of transport in national and sectoral gender policies. We can look for designing and implementing gender policies, and Sonal also mentioned about the policies. It can look at the HR aspect of it, looking at the retention and the recruitment of women. And it can also look at the policies that guide what the work that is done by the organization. The other important aspect is about the participation. So how we can adopt proactive approaches to improving gender balance in the project planning, implementation and monitoring, as well as project generated employment. Accessibility, this includes, that we can use the gender analysis to inform a selection criteria, for example, for road sections and design of the urban transport services. We can consider and address gender barriers across the network of time, including attention to immediate and intermediate means of transport. The affordability includes, gender issues in tariff policy, cost recovery schemes, flexible tickets, and cost of transport services. As Sonal explained to us, these all different things matter a lot, to men and women very differently. Acceptability, this criteria refers to gender implications of physical designs, such as universal access in vehicle and station design, safe and secure the issue for women only spaces, sidewalks. But then again, safety and security is one of the primary factors influencing women's mobility preference. Women in many cities regularly pay more to use taxis and ride hailing services in order to avoid harassment and public transportation. Actually, women give more importance to safety and security than the convenience of travel. Then we have employment and livelihoods, so there has to be an avenue to improve employment and livelihood through different project activities. And my colleagues, Alice and Pam will share some of the gender design features regarding this. Can we move on to next slide, please? So these are the different gender, different consideration for gender analysis. The link between gender equality and transport interventions become clear when the attention is given to different transport needs, purposes, modes of travel of men and women, instead of a narrow focus on the provision of hard transport infrastructure. These people-centered questions are critical to ask and understand if transport investments are to deliver inclusive results and bring equitable benefits for men and women. So what are the different key questions that we should ask in the gender analysis? And some of the key questions, we have compiled for you are, what are the different needs and priorities of men and women transport users? What are the gender transport patterns of different groups, such as journeys different groups make, for what purpose, how? So when we ask these questions, we get an answer that, okay, we need to have design centered around these needs of people. What goods do women and men move? What are the gender related barriers that exist in accessing transport infrastructure or services? We also need to ask, were women or women groups were able to participate equally and consulted in preparatory services and design? What are the relative costs of travel in time, effort, cash, and lost opportunities for men and women? And then what are the potential impacts on men and women as determined through social impacts, gender impacts, preparatory surveys and feasibility studies? And most importantly, is sex disaggregated baseline data collected and is to be used? We can move on to next slide, please. So once we are looking at the gender responsive design, there are different key questions that can be considered here, because gender responsive design is one of the prime focus of a transport sector project, because it's about the design, and as Sonal and Pam emphasized in their presentations, that the transport sector is not just the transport sector, but the only sector that also link with for the employment for the other sector. Like, for example, if we have to move for work, we use the transport, or there is a focus on the employment within the transport sector. So once we look at the design aspect, we can ask some questions, that what physical design features can specifically benefit women users versus men users, what livelihood opportunity exists for women, how can these projects maximize the social and the economic benefits of improved transport connectivity for women, what measures can be included in planning, design, implementation, and monitoring to improve gender equality in project management, civil works, and safety provisions. Are women employed in civil works in the project area? Do the construction contracts for civil works include a provision for recruitment for women? Then is there a provision for equal pay for equal work? What is being done to prevent gender discrimination at the construction and the and the maintenance stage? Basically, women should have equal opportunities to access all kinds of employment. What is the gender balance in the stakeholder groups, and is there a need for training, capacity development, for mainstreaming policy affirmative actions, for skilled labor such as technicians, engineers, managers, but also for, how we can maximize opportunities for unskilled labor for women. Can there be targets regarding this? So what we need to ask that what gender indicators can be used in project design and monitoring framework, and these all questions will help us to build answers for that. That will become response to the gender inequalities, in the areas where the projects are going to be implemented, and the project is going to provide a response to them. With this, we will move now to the fourth slide on gender design features, and I will now request our colleague Alice to take over and explain to us different gender design features. Over to you, Alice. But meanwhile, please continue to type your questions and on the chat box, and we will reply there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabjot. So for now, I will give examples of possible gender design features for each of the gender entry point, or a general gender entry point that Prabjot mentioned earlier during the when you ask key questions on what possible gender design features can be put into a specific transport project. So I have three in your screen. You will see three possible gender entry points, and under each one are the gender design features. This is not all the gender entry points. Pam will be discussing some other gender entry points. So for this particular gender entry point on infrastructure design and construction, this would include specific facilities or design features that could be put in any highway, any road project, such as streets that are well lighted with pedestrian crossings, waiting sheds, pram-friendly sidewalks, well-lit stations, all this. Please do not look at this as a shopping list. These are just specific examples from various transport projects we have had in the past decade or so. Also included as possible gender design features under infrastructure design and construction is the community development infrastructure. In some projects, this will be frowned at and seen as how does that relate to a transport project. But in many of our countries, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we have to include community development infrastructure for those communities wherein the roads we are building would pass through. So this could include something like roadside market stalls, solar lighting for households, and community creches. The second gender entry point will be on public transport services. What are the gender design features that we could put into public transport services? So these are the features that would address issues of accessibility and affordability. So for example, we look at the bus service schedules that coincide with women's errand routes and that are linked to multimodal transport systems. So Prabjot also mentioned ticketing for off-peak hours, etc. For buses, there would be buses and trains. There would be separate women's sections in buses that would be done as well. And then women-only transport, such as the pink taxis in Pakistan. Public transport services should also address issues of safety and security. So one of the major issues for women using public transport is the issue of sexual harassment, bullying, and other petty crimes. So these public transport services should have these mechanisms to address these petty crimes. This would include visible campaigns against sexual harassment, trained staff and drivers to address such cases, and then places where women can report and where these incidents can be recorded. And then the third gender entry point will be looking into women's participation in the sector. So first on women's participation as part of the community wherein the project is being done. So this would include women's participation in stakeholder consultations, community awareness training on road safety, and community awareness raising on issues of sexual harassment, gender-based violence in public places. And then we could look into women's participation in the transport sector, either as staff or as service providers, maybe as drivers, mechanics, and even traffic enforcers. Of course, this is not possible in many countries. So preparations for women's participation in the transport sector could come in the form of encouraging more women to get into the sector through engineering courses, also showing more women models in the transport sector, women drivers, women engineers, women pilots. And of course, as far as entrepreneurship is concerned, we can have incentives for women entrepreneurs in the transport system. For example, as owners of taxi companies or of businesses such as auto repair. Again, this is not a shopping list, but these are some examples that would inspire you to put in gender in your transport projects. So I hand over now to Pam, who will be discussing the next gender entry points. Pam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. And allow me to just keep my video off because I'm having a bit of a poor connection this morning. So, okay, so this is one slide I'd like to just share briefly on gender features, more relating to promote employment and entrepreneurship. And I'd like to start from the right-hand side of the slide. And this is on sector and institutional gender responsive policies. So I think, we often talk about, like first last mile connectivity, the physical aspects, but I think this one is not so much explored. And this is talking about promotion of policies that promote employment and retention of women and supports transition of women workforce to more highly skilled jobs. And this refers to inward policies that guide business practices of the organization. And then, of course, we have HR policies also that support specific responsibilities of women, such as, I mentioned earlier, like care work, maternity leave, and childcare support. And most importantly, I feel also is mentoring of young women and young female employees and supporting their professional growth through mentorships and scholarships and professional training programs, and even on the job. So the focus here is not just on recruitment, but also on retention and progression and support system. Another point is on sexual harassment, and this is really following and building on Sonal's poll as well. And the point here is to emphasize that any comments, remarks, or jokes that make women feel uncomfortable, that really has no place in any organization. And we really need to support to develop and implement a zero tolerance to any type of sexual harassment at work and provide an environment where women feel no hesitation reporting any misconduct or harassment. And then there's also the theme of safety of women at the workplace. As we know, as we have heard from yesterday and today, women are taking more intensive roles that demand greater devotion and time. And it means leaving the workplace late at night. I'm sure many of you here can relate to that. And how do we support with policies that ensure women reach home safely? And the use of surveillance cameras and security staff in and around the workplace that can help provide comfort and actual physical safety. And then I'd like to touch upon on employment. And for this, it's important to consider, for example, the skilled, unskilled labor issue, right? Like ensuring the unskilled work in construction are in line with core labor standards. And then, of course, there's equal pay for equal work. And of course, actually, in this pandemic, we're also seeing proliferation of advanced technology, and this has brought automation. And the question here is, that's creating more skilled jobs. And do these level the playing field for skilled jobs when physical strength is no longer a prerequisite to deliver the job? And I think this poses interesting opportunities. And also, and this of course applies to technical jobs such as, engineers and O&M technicians and so forth. And last but not least, we need to ensure that, it's not mentioned here, but the door-to-door journeys, and this has been mentioned before, the door-to-door journeys to work are safe and secure. And so now mentioned in the polls as well, and also by Prajot and Alice, most women use walk, cycle, and informal transport modes. And so how do we make this first last mile connectivity safe for women to access the job opportunities? And then finally, on the point on entrepreneurship, we can also look at gender-sensitive spaces for small businesses. And as you can see, marketplaces. How do we integrate that in transport facilities? And I think in some of the projects that we have already done, it's like provision of integrated walkways to marketplaces from domestic jetties, and also creation of spaces for small businesses at railway stations. And I guess we can also create like active frontages at key transport interchanges, which will combine all of these ideas, like, having small businesses, lighting and all that. So that's a whole active frontage concept, right? And that is particularly relevant to urban projects as well. And then, of course, there's rural-urban connectivity, how rural roads can be connected to major roads to allow, a seamless connectivity to access markets. And so let me just stop here and hand over back to Prajot. Thank you. Oh, sorry, there is a video. Oh, sorry. Right, okay.
No, that's in the next session. We will have case studies. So I'll start first. Thank you, Pam. So
thank you.
Thank you. So now, when we have presented the different gender entry points, discussed the key questions that can be asked during the gender analysis, we can see now some of the case studies from ADB projects. For that, we have different presenters with us here today. in this session. Our first example, is from Philippines. Actually, it's a railway project from the Southeast Asia Department, Malolos Clark Railway Project, or MCRP. This project was approved in May 2019 and is currently under implementation. MCRP is a 53-kilometer line that comprises of Malolos to Clark section and Solis Blumtif section, which links to the project to the existing line. And it will this project will also features country's first airport express train service, cutting down the travel time from Manila to Clark International Airport in less than an hour. And to present this project, we have two presenters from MCRP. We have first Corinne Hidalgo. Corinne is an architect who joined North-South Commuter Railway Extension Project in 2019, and she is these part of stations team and accessibility lead under gender equality and social inclusion for the project. Then our second speaker is Mary Jignil Tangente. GK is part of North-South Commuter Railway Extension Project as Community Development Officer and currently Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Team Lead. While our presenters present, please continue to raise your questions through the chat box. We are running a little bit late on time, so we will respond there. Over to you, Corinne, for your presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Prabjot, for the introductions. Good day to everyone. Thank you again for this opportunity. So I'm Corinne Hidalgo, and my pronouns are she and her. Since we don't have a lot of time, we'll jump right into it. So in developing the Malolos Clark Railway project, it's been extremely important that ADB has gender and development policies that has foresight to what challenges, but also opportunities the construction and eventual operation the project can present. Could you go to the previous slide? Thank you. To further contextualize the scale of the project, we have the following figures. So we have at least 4,000 project affected persons or PAPs. We have 9 LGUs that the alignment will pass through, around 7,000 jobs during construction, around 3,800 jobs during NSCR operations, and 105,000 expected daily riders when it's fully operational. So these figures give us a clear picture of how important it is to mainstream people-related concerns in all aspects of the project. In particular, we want to emphasize that our team shifted from looking at gender as a homogeneous group and started recognizing intersectionality on inclusion within. So we've tried to recognize that the intersectionalities of gender and disability, which we will dive more into later on in the presentation. So first, we'd like to explain where the momentum for intersection between gender equality and social inclusion started. When I first onboarded to the project, the gap was really crucial as it was the catalyst in identifying what the project needed. In analyzing the gap, we reached a turning point when we realized that we should not just take into account women's concerns, but all types of women's and other vulnerable groups' concerns into consideration. There were women who belong to the LGBTQ plus sector. There were women who have disabilities. So as a railway project, it was important to recognize the mobility of not just able-bodied persons, but also of those people with disabilities that would have mobility restrictions. So it was equally important that their issues should also be addressed. Moving forward, it was helpful that the gap outlined what spaces we needed in the stations and provided us a reference which we could show our designers to follow. So we were therefore able to provide the following spaces in the MCRP. We have breastfeeding rooms in both the station and depot. We have gender inclusive multi-purpose toilets that are also accessible. We have diaper changing cubicles for both female and male toilets. We have a female to male toilet ratio of 2:1 to lessen the long waiting time women experience in using public restrooms. We also have GBV guided gender-based violence help desk and a safety room to address the more sensitive concerns. It's specifically called a GBV help desk and not a women's help desk because we recognize that gender-based violence can happen to anyone. So we ensured to put this so that anyone who encountered harassment in the trains or station would have a place to go. We also have accessible facilities to honor the intersectionality we mentioned earlier, such as accessible customer service counters. We have tactile paths for people who are blind or have low vision and use the proper non-slip types and have warning, directional, and positional tactiles. We also have wide automated fare collection system gates for those in wheelchairs. And we've also extended the gender concerns for during construction. So our contractors' site offices provide separate living quarters and toilets for male and female and have accessible toilets as well. Our team was able to conduct a series of focus group discussions with several marginalized groups, such as women with disabilities and persons with disabilities who also belong to the LGBTQ plus sector. So these consultations were very meaningful in recognizing the fact that there are indeed challenges they face in using the existing public transportation. And by providing the spaces in the slide, it would already help address those and make them feel safer, included, and comfortable in using our railways. In the early stages of gap preparation, we realized how important these provisions should have been threaded and itemized a lot more in the bidding documents during the procurement stage. How well the bidding documents reflect gender and inclusion provisions greatly determines the strength of its implementation later on. So in the MCRP, there was actually some navigation to be done with our contractors after awards since we were not able to flesh out all our requirements during procurement. It was fortunate, however, that our contractors were willing to take on our requests, even though they weren't so explicit in our documents. So this was part of our learnings in the MCRP, which we've applied in the South section of our project. In the annex of this presentation, it shows where in the bidding documents we were able to insert these provisions. So giving information on to the bidders, we think would have greatly helped them in terms of preparing a more quality output for gender concerns. Besides infrastructure, we also developed other policies to further strengthen our gender equality and social inclusion goals. So for this part, I'd like to call on my colleague, Jiki, to discuss. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Karim, for your presentation. Good day to everyone. I'm Jiki Tangente and my pronouns are she and her. I will be sharing guidelines, policies, programs made to complement efforts at the infrastructure level, serving as guidance on how these infrastructures will be used as intended. First is the accessible travel policy, which aim to require railway operators to provide railway transportation that does not discriminate and should be accessible to all, empowering persons with disabilities to use railway with dignity, comfort, and confidence. Second, related to ATP, is the redesign of the Philippine Railway Institute curriculum. It is a report which recommends embedding social inclusions the current PRI curriculum so that railway staff are capacitated to assist passengers with disabilities. Third is the gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, or the GBV-SEA guidelines. It includes discussion on the details of GBV-SEA, its operationalization, and grievance redress mechanism. These guidelines will be the basis on how GBV-related cases between commuters and daily users of the railway will be handled. Furthermore, based on the draft NSCR operator concession agreement and the gap of the South section, operational plans and management will require project proponents to have their own GBV-SEA action plan and committee and skilled and sensitive service providers. Lastly, our team created a gender equality and social inclusion training program, which aimed for PMO to acquire needed skills, knowledge, and attitude in addressing the barriers and challenges of gender inclusion mainstreaming in the NSCRX project. Speaking of challenges, based on our experience in MCRP, gender and inclusion requirements were seen as trivial or even just a supplementary requirement. This was addressed by the team by creating a separate work stream solely focused on GESI, but with close coordination with other work streams, as well as the establishment of system of monitoring and evaluation, such as having a GESI monitoring tools, trackers, and institutionalized reporting. Based on all of these efforts done by our team in MCRP, here are some of our key takeaways and recommendations. First, consider gender and inclusion in all stages of the project. In MCRP, we learned that there are a lot of opportunities for gender and inclusion mainstreaming. For example, in relation to project design at the construction stage, mainstreaming was evident by requiring contractors of having gender-responsive temporary facilities and establishment of GBB help desk on all of its offices. Second, inclusion of comprehensive and concrete gender and inclusion requirements in all necessary documents. Seeking how gap provisions are published in the bidding documents will greatly ensure proper consideration of the bidders for gender and inclusion. Furthermore, itemizing specific requirements from local laws and department orders will increase its chances of implementation as opposed to referencing entire documents. From our experience, we actually recommend giving bearing to gender and inclusion during bid evaluation, as we believe this will ensure the bidder's output for proper gap implementation. Third, project proponents are committed gender and inclusion advocates. This may be very ideal, but in our team, we are very thankful that the gender inclusion mainstreaming is done easily because of the support from the leadership and management. Also, advocate may be a strong word to use, but at the very least, having an appreciation of the importance of GESI and inclusion can make a difference in the collaborative effort among all work stream and partners in GESI mainstreaming. Thank you for your attention, and would like to give our deepest appreciation to ABB. This opportunity gave us a voice and much needed opportunity to further gender equality and social inclusion in the transport infrastructure sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne and GK, and really appreciate that you could take time from your, from your work and be with us and present this wonderful project. I think the project has a lot of potential. Was really amazed to see how you have incorporated gender-based violence in this transport sector project. It's a big focus of the project, and I'm sure there are learnings from this project for our other projects. We will now quickly move to our second case study example, and I will request all the participants that if you can continue to type your questions, and our presenters will respond directly in the chat box. In the interest of time, we are not having Q&A after this presentation. So our second project, now we will go from Southeast Asia Department to Pacific Department, Pacific region, and this project is a water transport project from Kiribati. The Outer Island Transport Infrastructure Investment Project from Kiribati aims to improve safety of inter-island navigation and provide resilient outer island access infrastructure, ship-to-shore transfer, and land transport for the selected outer islands in the Gilbert Islands chain of Kiribati, namely Abiang, Nonoti, Beru, and Tab South. This project will strengthen also, focuses on strengthening capacities of implementing agencies, but you will be surprised to see how the project has incorporated, again, the issue of gender-based violence. For this, we have Cindy Bryson, Social Development Specialist from Pacific Department with us to present the project, but we also have Chasang, Project Team Leader with us, present in this in the training. And so over to you, Cindy, for your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Prabjot. Before I begin, I just wanted to introduce Chasang, who is the project team leader. And then during project processing, the project benefited from the guidance of Myri McRae, who's on paternity leave, as well as Prabjot, who previously worked in the Pacific Department on an STA. We also have Joanne Quintana on Zoom, and she's been supporting the project since approval. So both Chasang and Joanne will answer any of your questions that you have in the chat. So please send them through during the presentation. Now, this is a transport project that not only combines hard and soft approaches to gender mainstreaming and gender responsive design, but one which also extends interventions into preventing and responding to gender-based violence within communities. And it's beyond the project impacts. Next slide. To begin, let me tell you a little bit about Kiribati. So Kiribati is one of the most remote and geographically dispersed countries in the world. It has, next slide, it has 33 small islands spread across 3.5 million square kilometres of ocean. And it's an area about sort of larger than India. About 55% of the population of 115,000 live on the main atoll of Tarawa, which has an area of only 16 square kilometres. It's tiny. The remainder of the population are dispersed in small communities across 20 populated atolls, and they're within 3 main island groups: the Gilbert Islands in the west, the Line Islands in the east, and the Phoenix Islands in the centre. Next slide. These low-lying atolls are highly exposed to the effects of climate change, and that includes sea level rise, increased intense rainfall, and then increased wind from tropical cyclones. Next one. Movement between the islands involves air and sea travel, but really both struggle to meet reliable services. Airfields are occasionally closed because of poor runway conditions. Maritime transport is used for passenger, cargo, and vehicle movement. But, sea voyages often take several days. The distant island communities sometimes wait long periods for resupply. Next slide. High-profile maritime incidents in 2009 and in 2018 have really highlighted the inadequate hydrographic survey data. So there are no international standard nautical charts, and there's inaccurate information on tidal movements. So as well, the outer islands access infrastructure is inadequate and really lacks the sort of qualities of resilience. Next slide. Safe and resilient transport infrastructure is really essential for connecting Kiribati's population to the economic opportunities and also the social services in the capital. So next slide, safer transport infrastructure is key to achieving the government's objective to stop migration from outer islands to the capital, which is already overcrowded and congested, as you can see by these images previously. So the slide, so the project aims to improve safety and resilience of transport connectivity with infrastructure improvements in 4 of the prioritised outer islands. The project is co-financed by ADB and the World Bank, and it was approved in June 2020. Next slide. Output 1 aims to improve inter-island navigation by conducting a hydrographic survey, installing tide gauges, and producing nautical charts. Output 2 installs aids to navigation and builds and rehabilitates marine facilities. And output 3 builds the capacity of key government agencies. Next slide. According to the government of Kiribati, gender discrimination is culturally entrenched and presents a major challenge that will take sustained normalisation. We're talking over a period of years before noticeable changes can occur. Kiribati has one of the lowest numbers of women represented in national parliament in the world, and only 33% of women participate in the labour force compared to 53% of men. Girls and women tend to start their families early, and by 18 years of age, 20% of girls are married. Next slide. In the capital, there is an observable trend towards women studying and working in non-traditional sectors. Female graduates are finding work on development projects, but consultations highlighted challenges for female staff working within male-dominated fields. And it's such things as what we've heard previously today, such as inappropriate comments and sexual jokes in the workplace, and feeling unsafe during work-related travel. Next slide. Due to the high competition for employment and gender bias, consultations revealed that it would be unlikely that women in outer islands would be selected for day labour positions on the project. In the outer islands, the men claimed that women speaking with or working with unfamiliar men would likely cause jealousy and would contribute to increasing risk of violence against women, which is widespread in Kiribati. Next slide. So more than 2 in 3 women in Kiribati report experiencing physical or sexual partner violence in their lifetime. Next slide. 60% of women had experienced physical violence from a partner, 46 had experienced sexual violence, 47 had experienced emotional abuse, and 90% faced controlling behaviours from their partner. Next slide. 10% report having experienced sexual violence from a partner, from a non-partner, and almost 1 in 5 experienced sexual abuse as a child, with some survivors often being shunned from their communities. Next. It has been found that girls as young as 14 years of age board fishing vessels to engage in sex in exchange for money or goods. Kiribati is also on the US Trafficking in Persons Tier 2 watch list. The project is categorised as effective gender mainstreaming, and 2 of the 3 outputs have gender indicators. The Gender Action Plan includes actions to increase women's participation in the project, including construction, increase future trade opportunities at the project sites, prepare knowledge products on women's transport habits, initiate a mentoring program for female government staff, and pilots an all-female maintenance team. The project was screened using the World Bank's gender-based violence risk assessment tool and was classified as having moderate risk. As a result, the gap includes the development and implementation of a gender-based violence framework and will implement activities to prevent and respond to violence. Initial mapping has indicated that each of the priority outer islands has police presence, small health clinics, and assistant social work officers in place who have the responsibility to receive and refer survivors and provide counselling. Risk mitigation activities will directly address the gender-based violence-induced risks by the project, including a code of conduct for workers and managers, training, IEC materials, and training for government agency staff. The third activity will ensure high-quality response to gender-based violence cases in project areas, using a referral system, training for police, health staff, and counsellors, regular awareness raising on gender-based violence in project areas, and a gender-based violence specific GRM. The GAP also includes a support fund for survivors, which was very much needed for those in the outer islands. To sum up, next slide. The project provides a good example of a transport project that has moved beyond sort of usual gender measures and includes piloting all female maintenance teams and proactively set in place risk mitigation and response measures that go beyond the project and benefit women and girls within the project communities. I suspect that such measures can be included in more transport projects financed by ADB. I encourage you all to review the project gap on the website and begin discussions with your IAs to make it happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Cindy. I think you raised a very important point. So, this being a water transport project and the way it has integrated the issue of gender-based violence, which if you're working in Kiribati cannot be ignored. So I think it's a good example. And since we are a bit behind the time, I will ask everyone to just keep on posting your questions in the chat box. Our presenters are responding to your question. We will now move on to the next examples. I will now invite Alice to take us through the next examples. Over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabjot. Okay, this particular session will be focusing on the transport-related gender design features of two Pakistani projects. The first one is on the Karachi Bus Rapid Transport Project, and the second one is a video of one component of the Flood Emergency Reconstruction and Resilience Project in Pakistan. That particular component focuses on the reconstruction of roads and bridges. These two projects in Pakistan are especially, we chose this for a reason. Mainstreaming gender in transport projects in Pakistan is especially challenging given the pervading patriarchal culture that generally restricts women's mobility. However, because of increasing education of women and the increasing use of social media, these open up women's use of and visibility in public spaces. So these two projects are being done in this seemingly paradoxical context where you have the prevailing traditional gender roles on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have where education and mass media encourage women's participation in non-traditional jobs and at the same time demand safe access to and use of public transport system. So let's now look at the first project. Okay, the first project is led by and is being led by Lloyd Wright, our senior urban development specialist, and he has asked me to do this presentation. It's a brief presentation focused on the gender design features of this project, but he will be on hand to answer questions related to the project. So maybe a quick run through of the gender issues against which we designed the gender features of this project. So for the Karachi BRT, the prevailing gender issues that are relevant to this project are, one, as I mentioned earlier, the restrictive sociocultural norms which constrains women's mobility. Second is the women's limited access to safe, reliable, and affordable public transport. And then, but at the same time, majority of working women depend on public transport and sometimes use shared private transport, which may not always be that safe. And then another key gender issue is the high rate of sexual harassment in public transport places, as well as any other public spaces. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just go through the specific gender design features of this project. So at the outcome level, we have set targets relating to three specific programs or three specific gender actions of the project. First, the project instituted a safe BRT travel program. This includes campaigns to make travel in the BRT safe. So a lot of mechanisms to ensure women's safety are put in place, such as reporting and recording mechanisms, and then the staff are trained on handling cases of sexual harassment. And then we have the ridership surveys, which is, of course, is aggregated by sex, age, employment, ability, and other social features. So these ridership surveys will ensure that women riders are asked and are part of the survey. So it will measure ridership satisfaction, and the whole point is to increase female riders, to encourage women to use the BRT. And then at the end of the project, we will be conducting the BRT impact study. Next slide, please. Okay, this project has two outputs. The first output is Karachi's first sustainable BRT corridor and associated facilities constructed. So the gender features that we included under this first output are, among these are the social and gender inclusive BRT stations, wherein you have the platform level boarding, wherein to facilitate access or the movement of prams from the station into the bus. And then in the stations, you have separate male-female restrooms, and then there are separate queues for women. Of course, within the stations are also visible anti-harassment, anti-bullying campaigns. And then within the buses, you have segregated seating for male, females, signages in local languages, anti-harassment posters. And if you will see in the photo, each off-corridor bus has to have both a male and a female conductor. This is again to ensure the safety of women riders. In selected number of stations, we have also allocated commercial spaces for women entrepreneurs. Next slide. The second output, next slide, please. Okay, the second output is on effective project management and sustainable BRT operations. So here, if you remember the gender entry points we discussed earlier, one of which is the institutionalization of gender mainstreaming in the EAs and IAs. So in this particular output, women staff, or there will be an encouragement of having more women staff in both the IAs, the Sindh Mass Transport Authority and the Trans Karachi, more female service providers, and then the staff itself of these two IAs will be provided with gender sensitive training, as well as all the trainings relevant to the project, especially if they are technical trainings, should have allocated or should have women participants. And then a review of the HR policies will also be done to ensure their gender sensitivity and to ensure that women are not discriminated in terms of promotions and other work-related issues. And then the other part of this sustainable BRT operations is to ensure gender responsive operations. Specifically, we look at the feeder routes and the schedules and ensure that they cater to women's travel needs. And then staff are trained to handle women's passenger needs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there will be female conductors, female guards in the stations. If you look at the photo, this was provided by the project itself. You have on the left hand, you will see the women-only queues. And then on the right side, this is a photo from another BRT project in Punjab, where there are bikes for use of riders, and there is an allocation for women users of these bikes. The bikes that will take them to the stations where they will park the bikes, and then they get on the BRT. So these are briefly the gender design features of this project, and we are open to questions, and Lloyd will help respond to these questions. Thank you very much. Okay, the next project that we are doing, or rather I am going to introduce, is a project, or rather, as I mentioned earlier, a component of the Flood Emergency Reconstruction and Resilience Project. This is not going to be a presentation, but more of a video. So may I request that the video be uploaded now, and then I'll make some comments later on after the video is shown. Thank you.
2014 में जो सैलाब आया उससे हमें काफ़ी नुकसान हुआ। हमारा ही नुकसान नहीं बल्कि सबका नुकसान हुआ था।
बहुत परेशानी सी, मकान जड़ा है ना, खतरे भी सानी, रोड बंद सी ना, रास्ता कोई नहीं सानी, 3 दिन भूखे भी रहे।
इतनी स्लैड हो गई, मेरी मकान भी मेरा स्लैड में आ गया, इतनी बड़ी बड़ी तराड़ें पड़ गई, मेरे माल मवेशी भी नहीं चल सकता था, मैं खुद नहीं चल सकती थी। वो पानी होता था, मेरे घर में भी पानी था, फिर रोड में पत्थर थे, अस्पताल भी नहीं जा सकती थी।
ये बहुत ही क्रिटिकल एरिया था जिसमें फौरी तौर पर जो फ्लड से मुतासरा कम्युनिटीज थी, इनकी रिहेबिलिटेशन करने के लिए इस नेटवर्क को बहाल किया जाए।
हमने बहुत ज़्यादा जो फोकस किया वो ये किया कि सिर्फ इंजीनियरिंग जो है ये काफ़ी नहीं है किसी भी फ्लड या डिज़ास्टर रिस्क को रिड्यूस करने के लिए। तो हमने बेसिकली बायो इंजीनियरिंग का, फॉरेस्ट्री और जो लोकल प्लांट्स थे और श्रब्स थी का इस्तेमाल हमने खासकर लैंडस्लाइड प्रोटेक्शन, दोनों एस्पेक्ट्स को, इंजीनियरिंग और बायो इंजीनियरिंग को मिलाकर काम किया। सोशल इंजीनियरिंग का एस्पेक्ट था, उसमें हमने ख़वातीन की इन्वॉल्वमेंट जो थी थ्रू नर्सरीज, हमने उसको इंश्योर किया ताकि उस इलाके में एक इकनॉमिक एक्टिविटी जनरेट हो, एक जॉब क्रिएशन हो।
महकमा जंगलात कालू की तरफ से उन्होंने हमें खुद पौधों की डिमांड की, उनकी वजह से नर्सरी बढ़ा दी है, 30 से 70 कनाल लेके गए, तो फिर उससे हमें काफ़ी फ़ायदा हुआ है। पहले घर नहीं था, घर बनाया है, ज़मीन नहीं थी वो ख़रीदी है, अब बहनों को पढ़ा रही हूँ, एक स्कूल खोला है। और इससे हम ख़वातीन को ट्यूब्स वगैरह, बीज वगैरह उनको दे कर हम उनकी हेल्प कर रहे हैं। हम ख़वातीन सब मिलके एक मीटिंग रखती हैं, हम बात करते हैं तालीम के हवाले से, ये सिलाई कढ़ाई के हवाले से। घर में जो भी फैसला होता है मेरा होता है। पहले तो मेरी कोई बात सुनता ही नहीं था, मतलब अब मैं अब्बू को जो बात कहती हूँ वो मतलब हर फैसला मेरा वो सुनते हैं। मेरे हस्बैंड वो भी मेरा साथ देते हैं कि ये काम कर रही है। मुझे फ़ख्र है अब इस प्रोजेक्ट की वजह से कि हम आज यहाँ तक पहुँचे।
Okay, thank you for that. So as you can see, the reason why we chose this particular video is the fact that it focused, the innovative part that we would like to really show is the fact that women's roles in the reconstruction and recovery involve their planting of trees to stabilize the soil and prevent further landslides. Local women were encouraged to start these nurseries and grow the trees from seedlings and then sell and replant them on the steep slopes along the roads. So this addressed their need to not just recover from the floods, but recover economically, as well as increase their status in their households, in their families, when they are already starting to be more economically productive. So we end this presentation here. So I open now the floor to questions, if any, or do we still have time for that, Prabjot?
Hi, Alice. We don't have time. We are already running short of time. So we request everyone to post their questions in the chat, and Alice and Lloyd are here with us and they can respond in the chat. So
Thank you.
You can announce the break, Alice.
Okay. Sorry. So we'll have a few minute break. Sorry, it's just a 5-minute break.
Sorry, I wish we had 5 minutes, but sorry, we have only 3 minutes, so we will take a...
Sorry. Okay, so we'll have a 3-minute break, and then meanwhile you can post your questions, and then we'll address them. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be back in 3 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I'll request Pam to take us through the next part of the case studies. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Prashant. So in this next segment, we will turn to discussion on gender features to promote women in employment and entrepreneurship. So, but while the presentations are ongoing, please keep the questions coming in the chat box. We'll try to respond to them as best as we can. So in this first presentation of this segment, on behalf of SATC, I'd like to briefly share about the India Delhi Meerut Regional Rapid Transit System project. So it's the RRTS. So I'd like to highlight the key features of this design, and I will lean on Prajot in case you have any detailed questions, as she was closely involved in designing the gender elements of this project. So this was, the gender categorization was effective gender mainstreaming, and the investment project finances the first of 3 prioritized corridors of the planned RRTS network in India's national capital region. And this RRTS in Delhi Meerut would pass through densely populated sections of the NCR. And this would connect Delhi to Meerut in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Now, this 82-kilometer corridor, which is a very long corridor, will provide safe, reliable, and high-capacity commuter transit services between various locations along the corridor. And the investment project will finance rail tracks, signaling, station buildings, and maintenance facilities. So that's the large-scale, physical infrastructure component. And now I want to turn to the finer details of the project. And I just wanted to highlight the user-centered approach that was undertaken by the project team. And so while there was limited data that is currently available on women's travel patterns and perceptions along the future transit corridors, what was quite unique, well, or maybe we hope there's not going to be unique, but more widespread, but focus group discussions were conducted with women, and those revealed that they were often discouraged from using the public transport because of fears of harassment, lack of last mile connectivity, as well as inadequate hygiene facilities. And so consultations with organizations working with differently abled people also revealed that in addition to inaccessible streets and transport vehicles, the behavior of transport service providers is also one of the biggest obstacles in accessing public transport. And so these are very much, soft side kind of considerations. And in response to these challenges, gender features were developed. And I just wanted to highlight some of the key ones here. And so this involved development and institutionalization of gender-friendly workplace policies at the operator level, and also measures to enhance women's safe mobility. And this involved really a wide range of details, such as reserved coaches in the RTS trains for women, additional seats reserved for women and caregivers, elderly, differently abled, etc. And also differently abled facilities to cater to differently abled in all stations, and nursing rooms in multimodal stations, and also information helpline, etc. Moving on, the project also improved employability and entrepreneurship opportunities for 1,400 women, which is quite a big number, and also provided mobility, visual, and hearing assistive aids to 1,000 differently abled people in the urban areas of Ghaziabad, Meerut, and Modinaga. So just wanted to share that this is a nice example of how we can integrate non-physical aspects into big physical infrastructure projects. So with this, let me stop here and pass on to our next presenter, Soo Kim, who is investment specialist from PSOD, who will share with us on Fiji Airways COVID-19 liquidity support facility. Over to you, Soo Kim. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. The team, could you share the presentation? Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sue. I'm in PSOD the infrastructure team. So here, Fiji Airways COVID-19 liquidity support facility is a COVID response transaction to fund Fiji Airways minimum operational cost requirement during business shutdown caused by COVID-19. It's a private sector transaction. And here I would like to discuss how ADB was able to achieve effective gender mainstreaming for this transaction. At the beginning, we thought this may even be a no gender element transaction, as the company was under great pressure in their business environment because of COVID. But we pleasantly surprised by the receptiveness of the company in tackling gender issues. And let me discuss more later in the presentation. Next slide, please. And first, we started desktop gender analysis. From the analysis, we identified the gender gaps which can be addressed through this transaction. Physical and sexual violence against women is widespread in Fiji. Also, women is considered to be underrepresented in the country as well as for the airline sector. Although Fiji Airways was better than most airlines in the region on the gender. Next, please. There were great challenges as well as good opportunities. The government's restriction caused by COVID made Fiji Airways cancel all regular flights and most fleet grounded. 90% of revenue of Fiji Airways revenue evaporated suddenly. And to survive of this liquidity crisis, the company had to reduce all staff salary by 30%, 35% management, and terminated more than half of employment contract. Like all other airlines, Fiji Airways was going through tough time, and the gender discussion here was something very difficult to put on the table. But at the same time, we also identified opportunities here. Unlike some other kind monopoly characteristic infrastructure like power plants, roads, or airports, airline industry is competitive. Consumers have choice of airlines. They want to buy the tickets. Therefore, airline companies spend quite a significant budget for general consumer marketing. And gender can be a good marketing tool. Like you can find in this picture, it's not surprising to find a woman pilot in the advertisement or in the media. Also, as discussed earlier in the sector context, airlines have low baseline of women's representation in technical and managerial roles. Therefore, we viewed that ADB had room to suggest improvement on this angle. Next, please. So what has worked in this transaction to achieve gender mainstreaming? I believe these are the following. And first and the most importantly, the company's willingness and commitment is key. Particularly for this transaction, as explained, the company was going through a very difficult situation. So the ADB team had agreed before the discussion with the company, we can't push too much, and it would all depend on the company's genuine willingness and management's commitment to gender. And secondly, it's also important to identify the right person and talk to him or her. For Fiji Airways case, we were lucky to have Shanice Bose, Executive General Manager of Corporate Affairs. So she has title high enough to commit such corporate-wise policies, and was also a person personally very passionate about women participation in the company, coming from her own experience being the only woman in the managerial role for a long time. So our conversation on gender mainstreaming with the company went extremely well, and we could derive meaningful action plans. Again, considering the company's financial situation, it was a remarkable achievement. Another point to have successful gender action plan is to understand very well what the company already has, which we can use as an entry point. In this case, we knew the company has its own leadership program, and the separate aviation academy created recently. And those provided us the excellent entry point to promote women's participation for managerial and technical roles. We also identified the company already had anti-sexual harassment policy and third-party counseling program in place, but it didn't have a formal family violence policy, which is widely recognized and recognized social issue in Fiji. And also, just to add, the approach should be to propose gender indicators that are achievable and implementable by the client in the agreed timeline within the long tenure. So lastly, about the gender action plan. So here is the outcome of the gender action plan. This gender action plan was created as a result of gender analysis and detailed discussions with the client. Everything in here was explicitly agreed with the company. The gender action plan addresses two broad angles: promoting women's participation in technical managerial roles and developing family violence policy. For increased women participation, the plan tackles the issue through three different parts to make sure this is achieved. So again, wrapping up, our gender mainstreaming was achieved by senior management's strong willingness and commitment to promote gender equality. CEO of Fiji Airways, Andre Viljoen, spoke during the ADB Knowledge Forum last week. He himself hired a woman in CFO position, which never happened in the country before, and believes that the woman team changed the organizational culture, turning to embracing change, innovation, and openness. I believe such top management support let us achieve our ambitious gender action plan. And now we look forward to this being successfully implemented. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Soo Kim. I think this touches on two very interesting points. One, on supporting the aviation sector, which, as we all know, has been really badly hit in the past year. And secondly, it's a very nice example of how we can leverage on our financing support in these critical period of fiscal constraint to scale up gender aspects in projects. And I really like what you mentioned about talking to the right person. It's really important to find champions and leaders within the organization to create the ripple effect. So thank you so much, Soo Kim. Next up, we have a video to share on building roads in women's work. Thank you.
Cambodia is still an overwhelmingly rural country with many isolated areas. A big part of the way ADB promotes inclusive growth in Cambodia is through investing in rural infrastructure, and especially rural roads. ADB is assisting the Ministry of Rural Development to pave 500 kilometers of rural roads under the Rural Road Improvement Project. Plans are underway for another 1,000 kilometers in 10 provinces. The construction of these roads is itself a major economic activity. Engineers estimate that this road construction could generate up to 1 million workdays for workers around the country. At an estimated daily wage of $4 to $5, that could put up to $5 million in the hands of the rural poor. These jobs have traditionally gone to men, so we wanted to see if we could change that.
We wanted to find out what prevents women from pursuing this type of work. It was really the contractors that were the main obstacle. They were resistant to hiring women.
For
their part, women told us lack of information about job opportunity was the biggest problem.
Spending time in the field paid off. We shifted our focus to changing contractors' attitudes and to providing better information to rural women. With grant assistance from Australian Aid, ADB designed a pilot project to help rural women capture some of the jobs and the cash income. So far, more than 25,000 workdays have been created for rural women, This means more than $100,000 in wages. We know that rural roads improve people's lives in many ways, but they also bring jobs. Unskilled construction work may not be the ultimate answer to women's empowerment, but it does bring cash for women in areas where jobs are limited.
ខ្ញុំគិតថាឥឡូវនេះ contractor គាត់មានការផ្លាស់ប្ដូរច្រើនដោយគាត់បានយល់អំពីការងារផ្នែក gender ធ្វើឲ្យគាត់មានការឈប់រើសអើងគាត់រើសស្ត្រីចូលរួមមកធ្វើការដូចបរិសុទ្ធដែរព្រោះស្ត្រីគាត់ធ្វើការដូចបរិសុទ្ធបានដូចគ្នា
ក្រោយពីការងារយើងដើរមកយើងបានរើសកម្មករស្រីមកធ្វើឃើញថាការងារគាត់ធ្វើតាមប្រភេទការងារគាត់គឺធម្មតាការងារនៅទីនេះមានខ្យល់អាកាសល្អបរិសុទ្ធចាហើយងាយស្រួលក្នុងការមកធ្វើការមិនបាច់ចាំហត់ធ្វើដំណើរតាណាឆ្ងាយចានៅជិតផ្ទះ
By developing training materials for the Ministry of Rural Development, we hope to influence the way gender is addressed in future road projects. With the right approach, a relatively small investment like this one can make a big difference in rural women's lives.
Thank you. That was really nice. And I think with this, we have come to the end of this segment on women in employment and entrepreneurship. I hope you have enjoyed it. And due to time constraints, we will address the Q&A through the chat box. And with this, I will hand you back over to Prashant. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Yes, please keep on typing your questions. Some of the questions we are not able to answer, but we are taking note of your questions and we will revert to you. Now we move on to the third session of the day, third and last session of the day. This session is an interactive exercise for which we have Adam Sharp with us. So I will hand over to Adam, but before that, I would just like to share something about Adam with you. Adam is a futurist and a meaningful youth engagement specialist. He has spent 12 years in youth development sector, delivering educational advocacy programming to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Asia and Europe. Adam recognized an urgent need for a seismic shift in the education and skill building to meet complex global challenges. He founded Youth Futures think tank and foresight consultancy, Futurely. Co-founded the online futures learning platform, Meta Futures School with Sohail Inayatullah, and consults for multinational organizations, including a number of UN agencies, British Council, ADB, to name a few. He's also a member of the Association of Professional Futurists and sits on the advisory board of Noise Sustainable Cosmetics and Rapid Asia. So Adam, we have been discussing about the present conditions in terms of learning gender issues. We saw some of the implementation from the past from our projects. So now I hand over to you to take us to the future. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Prabjot. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you all today. First of all, just a big thank you to Zoni and Malika and Prabjot and the rest of the team. It's really refreshing to work with people who have a passion for what they do and a commitment to creating a better future. Let's get right into it. So if COVID has taught us anything, it's that the future is deeply uncertain, that a rare black swan event can disrupt all our policies, our strategies, our assumptions. And it revealed things we all knew, that our systems are interconnected, that a health crisis can lead to a social crisis, an economic crisis, an ecological crisis, a political crisis, an ethics crisis, etc. Some would posit that these other crises contributed to this health crisis in the first place, but I digress. Gender equality is much the same, isn't it? It intersects with society and technology and economy and ecology and politics. But often when we're stuck in the day-to-day grind, whether we're working for the ADB or any organization, mainstreaming gender into everything that we do can feel like a tick box exercise at times. We have a strategy in place in the form of Strategy 2030, which states gender is a priority for the bank. But do we have a compelling vision for what success looks like in 2030? Do we have a new measurement of it? Now, it's my job as a futurist to use tools like the one that we're going to use today to co-create a vision for the future together that is compelling, and that can bring back agency in times of uncertainty like the ones we're living in right now. And this helps organizations and teams move from that everyday management of reality, that everyday grind, to the creation of new possibilities. To move from narrow problem-solving approaches to broader, deeper, systemic, transdisciplinarian perspectives and solutions. Because in a world that's unstable, it's important, it behooves organizations like ADB to ask the tough questions like, can we survive in a business as usual future? And now this is the question that ADB is asking itself, and myself and Sahel Iniatullah at Meta Future School have been working across sectors to explore the futures of ADB and multiple sectors, but I digress. So we have tools to do this. We're going to be using the Futures Triangle today. This was included in your participant brief. It's a tried and tested, very easy to use tool that's recommended by ADB, and it's there simply to help us facilitate a discussion. It's not to make things overly complicated. We have all of you, with diverse backgrounds and skill sets and experiences from all over the world, with knowledge to share and new ideas to come up with. The only thing we don't have is that much time. We're dipping our toes into the world of foresight, ladies and gentlemen, if you will. But if you trust the process, if you give your all for this hour, if you switch on both your cameras and your minds, we can make the most of this session together and really come away with some new perspectives and plenty of understanding of each other's experience, but hopefully creating some new opportunities along the way. So I'll spend 5 minutes explaining the Futures Triangle. And then in plenary, for 15 minutes, we're going to do the Futures Triangle together as a big group. Then we will spend 20 minutes in breakout rooms. You'll have facilitators guiding you through some of the questions. And then we'll come back together for a final 10 minutes for group sharing. And that leaves me with 5 minutes wrap up. So it's a tight session, but again, if you really devote your attention to this session, then I think it's going to be really worthwhile. So if we could share screens on the Jamboard now onto slide 1, and you can see this is a Futures Triangle. Now, someone who's very helpful in the chat function will also share the Jamboard link in the chat function for those of you who are interested in using it. But let me explain what the triangle is first before getting into how we're going to populate it. So Futures Triangle is a foresight tool, and we use this to map plausible futures. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the future is not fixed. It's unpredictable, and it's shaped by multiple forces. So first of all, it's the vision of the future. The pulls, what's attracting us? Why is gender mainstreaming so important for Strategy 2030? Is to create a better world, right? So what is that vision of the future that we're striving for? Secondly, it's informed by the pushes of the present, the drivers, the visible issues we know about that we can see, the challenges that make us wish for a better future in the first place, the pushes of the present. And then lastly, the weights of the past, the weight of history, the old ways of doing things, the systems, the cultures, the forces that prevent innovation, that hold us back. Now, what we're going to do in plenary together is we're going to map these 3 corners out. Okay, I'm going to ask you certain questions, and this is going to be a real mix of logical thinking, but also creative thinking as well. And one thing to remember, one infamous futurist called James Data once said, any useful idea of the future should appear to be ridiculous, meaning in 10 years' time, in 2030, so much could have changed. And it may seem utterly radical to us in the present, but in 10 years' time, it will be just like normal. So really take time to think outside the box. There's no bad ideas. So to access the Jamboard, please click the link in the chat function, or you can open up your participant brief, click the link there. Okay, you can see the screen now. If you are a technophobic, I completely understand. Don't need to open the Jamboard at all. You can just share your ideas in the chat function. And we have scribes who are going to bring that information into the Jamboard for you. So please don't worry. Don't let technology get in the way of what should be just a really good conversation. What we'd like is for you in the Jamboard to share both sticky notes, okay, with a bit of information. Doesn't have to be too detailed. and also images if you wish. And there's some instructions on the left-hand side of the Jamboard of how to do that. Okay, it's just using the icons on the left toolbar. And of course, we welcome hand raising, where we'll ask you to turn off your mute and you can actually share verbally. And I might call on you if you share some information. I might say, why did you put that there? And it would be great to hear your voices. And lastly, it would be great to see your faces. Do not underestimate the impact on discussion and productivity that comes with having your cameras off. Having your cameras on means we can have a discussion. We can see the visual cues that are so important to communication. And if it's just for this hour, please turn off your camera, especially for the breakout room discussions, so you can really have a good conversation with each other. Okay, so let's begin. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you questions, and you can choose the chat function or the Jamboard to share data. So let's begin. We're going to start at the top of the triangle, the pulls of the future. So let me ask you, what would the ideal future for Asia Pacific in 2030 be? Considering our focus on the transport sector and on gender equality. What are we doing this for? What's our vision of the future? Now you can see already on the triangle, we've got inclusive, sustainable, and safe transport. Okay, that's what we want in 2030. But what does that look like? You know, what's that vision look like? What is sustainable transport? You know, what makes transport safe? What are the new systems in 2030 that have made this possible? So I just want you to take a minute or two, and when you're ready, please share. Now, if you wish to share verbally, that would be most welcome. I think we have hand raising. If not, we can just turn off mute, and welcome to hear your voices. So let's just take a couple of minutes. What's the ideal future? This is 10 years' time. A lot can change. Think about your own life, you know, your own experience, your own day-to-day experience. What does the ideal vision of 2030 look like? If you're cynical, much like me, park the cynicism for a moment. It's an exercise. We're just going to begin with the vision of the future. So just take a moment and just share whenever you're ready. We have about 5 minutes per corner, so this doesn't have to be perfect. We just need ideas. Okay, great. Here we are. Public transport is the norm. No private cars. Fantastic. And just drag them to the top of the triangle here. This is great. Now, someone has shared an image, which is great. Images are really good, especially for the pull of the future. Our vision leads, as Fred Pollack, the famous futurist, once said. Maybe I could ask whoever shared that image, could you share what this image is of and what it means to you?
Sorry, Adam, that was me. So I think actually this is a push for the present. We're seeing actually that is one measure that we're using in order to address some of the safety issues for women in using public transport and trains and metros. So I would think that maybe this is a push of the present rather than a pull for the future.
So thank you so much, Zoni. So two things, great that you're using images. Two, the questioning of whether something is a pull or a push is a very interesting one, and it's going to come up again. For now, let's focus on the pulls. Zoni, feel free to put that wherever you like, and we can move it around. But that's great. Thank you. We have more data being shared here. Barrier-free. Someone wrote barrier-free. Could you explain what you mean by barrier-free, whoever wrote that? Forgive me for calling on you, but we only have 5 minutes per corner, so I'd love to hear your voice. What do you mean by barrier-free? Okay, I don't know if something's being shared in the chat. Okay, that's all right. I respect that. Let's take a look at some of the other data that's been shared. Green and affordable public transportation, safe bike lanes all around. Women and girls don't feel scared on public transport at night. Wow. Women don't have to worry about sexual harassment while using public transport, problem even in developed countries. Now, what does technology look like in this future? Okay, we're already seeing the seeds of technology that can enable safety in transportation. What technology is available in 2030? Now, imagine 10 years ago, what was social media? It wasn't anything like what it is today. So imagine 10 years' time, what technology is possible. So this is really to encourage thinking outside of the box here. Wow, okay, so we've got women in leadership positions in the sector. What kind of policy is in place in this future? What policy helped to create this enabling environment? Was it women in positions of power politically that led to these shifts? Or women in power in the corporate sector? What changed? We have more women working in transport sector, self-driving vehicles. Okay, fantastic. So, we're looking at technologies that today we're just seeing the seeds of change. In 10 years' time, all the predictions say self-driving autonomous vehicles will be the norm. So this is exactly what we're talking about. These are the shifts that we're looking to see. How do we make sure we harness self-driving vehicles to create a world where women are equal? Mobility as service, app-based integrated multimodal transport planning. This is fantastic. And I don't know what that looks like, but you do, and this is exciting. Okay. Women don't have to walk long to access transport. Okay, this is fantastic. So I'm going to ask our scribes to just shrink down some of these sticky notes. Let's move on to the next step in the triangle. Just shrink down the sticky notes a little bit just so that the pulls don't dominate everything. Meanwhile, everyone else, let's move on to the next step in the triangle. Let's look at the pushes of the present. What are the drivers in the present of this future vision? What trends and technologies are changing the future right now? These are the things that are pushing change forward. Again, think steeple, think society, technology, the economy, ecology, politics, legal, ethics. What are the drivers in the present that are pushing us to try and create a better future in the first place? And we already have a couple. So here we have ADB Strategy 2030, Operational Priority 2. Pillar 1, women's economic empowerment increased. That's a policy, that's a driver. Okay, policies are drivers. The policy is pushing for a better future. Mobile apps to report harassment real time. Fantastic. Technology is involved. The climate and climate change. Absolutely. Climate change is a driver. Me Too, social movements. This is what we're talking about transdisciplinary perspectives and solutions, not just looking narrowly at one or two elements of the things we know about, but challenging ourselves to think more broadly. So this is great. More data presentable as evidence based on gender-related issues in transportation. Fantastic. Advanced technology levels the playing field for employment opportunities for all. There we are. Technology for employment, technology for safe travel, transportation, tracking, autonomous vehicles, and also employment. Pollution, congestion, urban decay. We need new systems of thinking and doing. Spend another minute. This is really good. This is a great group. You're all getting this. And I see a couple of images too, which is fantastic. So it's really cool to share both text and image. Again, if you're not interested in using the Jamboard, you can use the chat function. Merdin, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, says the 4th Industrial Revolution. Emily says, the youth are pushing governments to act. Civil unrest. Failure of governments run by men to address COVID and opening for female leadership. Okay, our inadequacies create the drive for change, new systems of doing. Andy shares practically more problems caused by humans, which require more complex solutions. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, more girls pursuing STEM. Why are more girls pursuing STEM? This is the enabling environment that's being created today. Strong desire to build back better from the pandemic, to move beyond rhetoric to actually create change. And we see expensive human resources. So there's a lot of drivers in the present for this new future that we want to create. This is fantastic. So once again, our scribes, can you just shrink down and tidy up the data for us? Meanwhile, everyone else, let's move on to the next step. The weights of the past. Despite all of these drivers, why is change so hard? What are the barriers to change? What is holding us back or getting in our way? You know, what are the deep structures that resist change? Now, we already have one sharing here, socio-cultural norms that limit participation and employment of women in transport sector jobs. Andy shares, humans, we are creatures of habit. We don't like change. Simply put, change is uncomfortable. It's precisely why futurists have a job, to help us think about the future and think about change in a structured way. Judy shares political environment. Absolutely, politics. Can you expand, Judy? What are the policies? What are the old systems of doing? What is it about our political environment that holds back change despite all of these drivers, despite the fact that we may have a shared vision of the future here that's exciting and compelling? Existing power structures. Fixed mindsets at leadership levels. Transport infrastructure is costly and therefore will take a long time to rebuild, rehabilitate, to make it more gender responsive. Absolutely. Again, in economic crisis, we heard from, I can't remember her name, just before we started this session. She said, because of the economic challenge that they were facing, it was hard to get gender on the table. Like, how do we prioritize this when all we see every day is the economics? Okay, unwillingness of management to change, budget constraints, silos preventing organizations from working better together, from creating change. Andy shares, changes in our values, more extremism and radicalism are propping out. So radicalism and extremism becomes the political leaning that holds us back from creating the change that would make radicalism and extremism not the attractive pull that it seems to be for so many young people. Herein lies the importance of creating a compelling vision of the future. Do young people today in Asia Pacific have a compelling vision of the future to think about anymore? Again, it was Fred Pollock who said, the image of the future leads. Without a compelling vision, societies and cultures break down. Okay, so you can see we've captured a lot of data here. This is fantastic, okay? And our triangle is absolutely packed. So thank you so much. This is a fantastic group. So let's stop populating. Okay, so now we have all this data. Okay, we have all this information. Scribes, you might want to start setting up your group board. Now that we've created this sort of map of the pulls, the pushes, and the weights, it now behooves us to think, well, what now? What next? A, is the data that we've got, is it right? Does it belong somewhere else on the triangle? But more importantly, how can we intervene? Can we intervene? Can we lighten these weights, the weights of silos and bureaucracy, of social, cultural norms? Is our vision of the future compelling enough? Can we articulate that in a better? Can we articulate it better? Can we become better storytellers to ensure that gender mainstream is no longer that tick box exercise? And for the pushes, do we need to do more policy advocacy to strengthen these drivers? So this is the key question. It's what next? So we're going to break you up now into your breakout rooms. They will be facilitated. You have your own scribes, and you also have your own slide in the Google Jamboard, okay, where you're going to be answering these 2 questions. Now, again, camera on, really important for this part. And feel free to just speak verbally rather than just using chat. Let's learn from each other. Let's make the most of this opportunity we have together, this short time we have. Okay, we're going to sign you into those breakout rooms for 20 minutes. You're going to try your best to answer those questions in that time. I know it's not enough time. And then we're going to come back together. And I just want to hear from each group, what were your key takeaways? Were there opportunities to intervene? Did you question the data that had already been shared? And then we'll do a wrap up. Okay, so if someone in the group is willing to speak, fantastic. If not, your facilitator will, but it would be great to hear from you. Okay, so when you're ready, let's break out into these rooms. I'll pop room to room just to see how you're all getting on, but I'll mostly be background. Okay, it's just going to take 1 minute to transfer into breakout rooms. Okay. So I think they might be just creating the breakout rooms. Does anyone have any questions while we wait for the breakout rooms to be set up? Now you can see, I think, I'm not sure who's sharing screen, but maybe you can shift to the other slides in the deck so they can see what they'll be populating. There you are. So each group has a focus on the triangle. Group 1 will focus on pulls. Group 2 will focus on pushes. There you see they've already brought the data in. And group 3 will focus on the weights. So you can have those discussions. Is everything okay with the breakout rooms?
Yes, we will just take
Yes,
1
we're
or 2
just
minutes.
assigning one by one. I'm sorry, it's taking time.
That's okay. How long do you need?
Probably 2 more minutes.
Okay, no problem. So why don't we, whilst we're waiting for that, why don't we share screen back on the Futures Triangle? And I just want to ask the whole group now, let's get in the spirit of sharing and discussion. If you'd like to verbally share, what are some of your, I don't know, maybe some new insights or takeaways just from the exercise so far? We haven't looked at what next, but does this exercise sort of help create structure amidst uncertainty? Is there any data that maybe you would question? I'll just open the floor now for anyone who'd like to maybe share.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
Rangina Nazrieva from CERD. I was looking at, while also putting the sticky notes into all the great ideas, and it came to my mind then that while we talk about future, we have to also remind ourselves. That's why I kept putting emphasis on rural communities and rural women, etc. In some of the countries, future for remote rural areas might be drastically different from a normal future we would think about. So perhaps putting an emphasis on that while talking about accessibility, etc., would make it more helpful and inclusive. Thanks.
Great point for a few reasons. First of all, you're all connected to stakeholders in various circumstances. And so to bring their voices into this session as much as possible is very much a good thing. And this brings me to a critical success factor of futures thinking. The more diverse, the better, because the future is different and it looks different to different stakeholders. So these processes are always enriched with more diversity. Because we all shape the future. So all these perspectives matter. It looks like, thank you so much, Rangina. So we're going to launch the breakout rooms. Again, camera on, enjoy your discussions, and we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you so much. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I was just in the weights group and Malika was just saying, we've got 5 seconds. Can anyone share some lessons learned? And I was like, oh, it's just tragic. So I hope that wasn't the case, but
It
it
is
is
tragic. Yes.
Yes, I don't know where the 20 minutes gone.
Right,
We were just discussing, but it was good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So again, we have 10 minutes left of this session, and we really want to hear from each group. Again, 2, max 3 minutes, ideally 2 minutes, just to share what were some of your takeaways. Ideally, what are some things that we can do differently? What were some examples of best practice that maybe were shared? Let's start off with the vision of the future, the polls. Group 1, would anyone like to share? And I will cut you off on 2 minutes, sadly, even though I hate to be the one to do that. Who would like to share from Group 1?
Okay, I'm volunteering for the Group 1.
Great.
Yeah. So I think like for the overall visions on the Group 1 as a polls, we agreed that the overall visions would be like a climate resilient, safe, green and affordable transportation that would equally benefit women and men. And how this could be materialized to strengthen this pool is to have the partnership with private sector and other stakeholders, and to have a communication with the media, to promote the media, to challenge the gender bias, and to promote equal images of women and men in the transport sector. To have an enabling policies, transport policies that are gender responsive in public and the whole transport sectors, including the regulations. Within ADB, there could be like to have more involvement of more project officers in the gender sensitivity training to build more capacities in these areas. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much. Again, I think the insight of we need more media to challenge these gender biases and promote equal images of women and men in the transport sector. I'm assuming, Chitra, like that's important because this vision of what this better future looks like in 2030 is not clear, right? It's not, it's not strong enough, what gender equality actually looks like and how it benefits, multiple systems and sectors. Is that right? Would you say that it's just not clear right now?
Yeah, because like there's no like, I remember like when Sony mentioned about that she's looking for the image of the a driver, like women's driver, like
doesn't even exist.
Like trucks doesn't even exist, when it's quite hard to look for that. So it's quite striking that in this age we are still having difficulties to find that.
Right. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, Group 1. I really hope you had a good discussion. Let's go to Group 2. The pushes of the future, the drivers. Would anyone like to share just 1 or 2 of the takeaways from your discussion?
Yes, I think I will volunteer and maybe others in the group can add. In terms of looking at what we know already, I think the policy pushes towards public transport that address both climate as well as regulating private transport needs to be inclusive and user-friendly. So I think there seems to be like a consensus around it. In what can we do to intervene? I think there were multiple things, but financing really stood out, as well as gender targets. And I think these were the 2 main aspects. I'm happy to have others in the group, Prabjot and others, to add.
In 30 seconds. Thank you, Sonal.
Thank you, Sonal. So, actually, we were having such an intense discussion in the group that, we didn't realize that the time is already over. It was, we had discussed on also on the budget in the O&M. There are some this slips in the on the Jamboard slide, like revisit procurement policy to explicitly require gender consideration. ADB should be involved more in developing STEM education in our DMCs as part of our transport projects, and the focus was on budget, on the employment, and on the needs of the women. So there needs to be an attention more towards gender resources, budgets, and implementation. So these were some of the different discussions that we had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabjot and Sonal. Thank you. And let's move to the next group, the weights. And can we lighten these weights? Can we create this future this vision of the future that we have? What can we actually do to lighten the weights? Who would like to share from group 3?
Rangina, can you do it? And we will add.
If you have time.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll try to summarize. I mean, sorry, I'm trying to save the bandwidth. So I think majority in the group agreed that building a partnerships in the DMCs, depending on the scenarios in each, of course, country, is important to kind of unite the voice, if I may, and then push the agenda. We also agreed that capacity across the DMCs at all level might not be homogeneous and therefore needs further strengthening. But that's not only the external stakeholders, but also internally within ADB, we should think of perhaps boosting the capacity within the teams. That's another point that we discussed. And then also using a business case scenario to it would be one of the leverages to on how we can push for the agenda. That's what I could quickly summarize. Please, group members, add more.
That's great. 30 seconds, Malika, or anyone on the team?
I think just one more. I think this was very important on how we can lighten the weight and also how we can move forward. It's like we have to think beyond the project, right? What we will leave after the project. And this was a good example from Alois Clark, right? We're establishing the system and the whole system with the policies, guidelines, toolkits, training, and capacity building for the staff who will be on the front line on addressing issues related to sexual harassment and GBV. So after the project, the Department of the Transport will take over this work, and it will be like their normal practices. So we're establishing the system and we support the system. But after ADB, the system will be in place. Thanks. 30 minutes, 30 seconds.
That was perfect, Malika. Okay, if we could stop sharing the screen now, that would be great, so we can just be in gallery view. First of all, I just want to thank everyone who, for the last hour, just really gave everything, because I popped into certain groups, and I would say there was more interaction and engagement than some other ADB meetings that I've been a part of. I'm sorry to say, and it's just I really appreciated some of the insights that were shared. Again, it's such a shame that we had such little time to really explore and go even deeper into some of these different perspectives and solutions, to hear more about what has worked in the past around the world and what we'd like to carry forward, and also to start creating new opportunities and ways of working, ways of thinking, ways of doing. So I hope that you see this very much as like a, dipping the toe into this foresight world. I recommend for all of you to read ADB's own report, Why Foresight Matters in Policymaking. It includes information about the Futures Triangle and other futures tools that you can use to have these conversations, with even more diverse stakeholders, to use this to work in interesting and new ways. If you can, just in the chat function, please write 1 or 2 words of how you felt about this session. I think all of the organizers who have worked so hard, Prabjot, Malika, Zani, the whole team, who have just really given everything to this session. I'm sure they'd love to hear your feedback, and I'd love to hear it too. So just take a moment to share, how you felt about this session. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn anything more about Futures of Foresight, please feel free to reach out to myself and obviously to the team, and maybe we can take this further to have more and more conversations like this and go even deeper. Merdin says, like being in the time machine. That's great. That's a good metaphor, I think, for Futures. Gives us that freedom of movement. Final 30 seconds before I hand over. Would anyone else like to share? Just 1 or 2 words. Lots of learning, Anne. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andy. Judy, awesome. First time. It's a relatively simple tool, but I mean, we could go much deeper than this, I'm sure. Fantastic. Hopefully this might contribute to the transport foresight study. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. I will hand back to Prabjot. From me, Adam Sharp, real pleasure. Hope we do this again sometime. All the best.
Thank you, Adam. It was, indeed a very thought-provoking exercise. You really transported us to the future and what kind of future we want. I think we need to have this discussion more, but we are already 1 minute up the time. So I will just now, invite Samantha Hong, Chief of Gender Equality Thematic Group, to give us closing remarks and for the evaluation of the program. Over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabjot and Adam. And that's actually, Adam, a really good segue, because part of what I'm going to be saying is inviting people to do a broader evaluation, which includes on this session. But I'm sure that everybody has, like me, found the past 3 hours really, really interesting. I've been quietly listening to all the discussions. I think we had a really rich day, starting from the scene setting of Pamela, Sonal's presentation, then the entry points by Pamela, Prabjot, and Alice, and then the sort of tour of the regions and good case study examples from Kiribati, Philippines, Cambodia, Pakistan. So it's been really interesting. And then ending up with this, I think, very engaging activity that Adam and others led. I think it was new for some people, but I hope it gave you a taste of what the potential of foresight work and using the tools can offer. And that's something that as a gender community, we ourselves would like to take forward next year. So with that, I won't take up any more time, but just to say that we really appreciate your participation. We had over 80 people for most of the time, and we've just lost a few in the past half hour. And we look forward to seeing some of you again tomorrow for our water focus session. But before we end, we'd like to put in the chat box the link to our very quick online evaluation. So for those of you that won't be joining us tomorrow or the next day, we'd really appreciate if you could take 5 minutes to fill this in now. It covers yesterday and today, and it's really important for us to get the feedback from you so that we can make our sessions that we offer even better in the future. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Is the chat, it's in there, the link? Roma, can you please put it in the link? We will also send it out to everyone.